I'd like to welcome Michael Ziegler, Professor of Medicine. Mike has made enormous contributions, not just in his own laboratory, but also in the general clinical research here at the university and also nationally. Mike has served on parent committees at NIH involved in review of very large center grants. Today's session is going to be focusing on responding to reviews. Now, if you recall the sequence of the lectures and the symposium sessions we've had, we've talked a little bit about the dilemmas of writing papers, the process of writing. We've talked a little bit about ways of monitoring your own writing. Now we're shifting a little bit to how you respond to the little love notes that we all receive from journals. And I use that sardonic term because most of the time these love notes are tactful, and requires an enormous amount of skill to read between the lines and to figure out what the reviewers are really saying. And it takes an enormous amount of skill, patience to figure out how to respond to reviewers who said the right thing, in your opinion, or who said the wrong thing. And how do you respond persuasively? And so that's what this session is going to be focused on. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention two other things that are coming up. You probably have all seen we've got the yearly announcement out for the KL2 competition. And if you have any friends who are interested, make sure that they go to the CTRI website to look at the announcement. Each year we tweak it ever so slightly in terms of eligibility and those sorts of things. So people should read the announcements carefully and by all means have them contact me if they have questions. The other thing is that next session we'll be having a mock study section. And I think it's really helpful experience. Have all of you decided, yay or nay, whether you wish to participate in the study section?
I have not yet decided.
Mark that
the deadline was Friday.
No.
Well, I'm not sure about that. The reason I'm just trying to press you on this because this is a lot of work. It's a lot of work on our part. It's a lot of work. It's not that much work on your part. It'll take maybe an hour. But I'd rather not go through the exercise of picking out grants for you to review, sending them to you, and having you come up with a conflict where you can't attend or you're late in getting the reviews. Because the other thing about the reviews is that study section, the executive secretary, I will be, has to do a fair amount of work organizing things in advance. So I'd like, you should do it.
Okay, I'll do it.
But will be one or three? I read there were three proposals or one proposal.
Depending on how many people I get to participate, you'll get one or two, maybe three. I doubt it.
Yeah.
We have a lot of proposals, and these are proposals that have come to CTRI before, and the agreement was that reviews can be useful, and so we'll send the comments back to the applicant before, and they'll be anonymized and all of that. I do want to remind you that this is confidential. You'll be seeing grants of friends and enemies and strangers. And please don't mention it. Don't mention it at lunch. Don't talk about it with anybody. It's just not done. So I'm hoping, I really would like you all to participate. Who else? Maureen, who have we heard?
Riley, Baron, Sanjay, and now Mike.
And Xavier.
Yes.
I'll do it.
Okay. You got it? The rest of you are not interested?
Out of town.
Out of town,
Yeah,
okay.
you're going to be out of town.
Okay, well, fine. That will make it easier for me if I know who's doing this. Are you doing it?
Yeah, I did get a chance to email back.
Okay.
Got
Okay.
it. You will too then? Okay. Before each of you leaves tonight, if you'll give me 3 keywords of areas that you feel you would be most expert to review. It will help us to send you the easiest to review proposal.
Now,
Relevant.
this, by the way, prepare for the real world. You will always be asked for 3 keywords, and you're lucky if you get a grant that corresponds to one of them. It's the exigencies of the review. It really is that way. Hopefully we'll get something that matches, but sometimes you won't, and you'll learn something new. Today we have really 2 parts. First, Mike is going to discuss with us some interesting data on review structure from NIH, and next we'll be talking about some of the reviews that we've all received. So I asked you to bring along copies of reviews of an article that asked for major revision, and we'll go through them and we'll try to get the wisdom of the group for how would we feel if we got a review like that, and how would we respond to it. And I think part of that, how would we feel if we got a review like that, is something to keep in mind when we write reviews ourselves. There are reviews and reviews. Some are helpful, some aren't. So, Mike?
Okay, thanks. Joel alluded to you have to read between the lines, and it reminded me of a phrase that I heard about someone who was reviewing submissions more in sociology and softer science. But they said they always, she worked with her husband in publishing, and they said they always made sure they sent back the reviews in what they called a praise sandwich. You start out with something that says this is wonderful, you end with something that says this is promising, and then in the middle you put the real comments. And so you have to read between the lines. Other things that you have to read between the lines, for grants at least, is comments about yourself. They should be effusive and say that you are wonderful. And if they don't, it means they have doubts. And that you need to get a co-investigator who will bring the skills that seem to be lacking then in the text content. So that's a little bit of between the lines, and indeed if you have an NIH grant review and you're overly honest, it'll probably be cut out in the study section before it makes it into the pink sheet. So I only printed out 10 of these. I didn't realize you were going to be so popular.
It's you, Mike.
But since it's only 1 sheet of paper, I don't think it's going to be a great deal lost. Just pass it around. What's there? And I just pulled some data out on what happens to reviews at NIH. And what I'll say applies as well to reviews of papers that you submit because the reviewers are pretty much the same. It's the same audience that you're going to, and there's a little bit difference in the structure. And so you'll find even that the substance of what is reviewed within an NIH grant and that really casts the most weight on the ultimate decision is the same kind of thing that will be reviewed in a research paper that you submit. And specifically, if you open up to this page with the side with the black dots in the upper left-hand corner in the graph. NIH changed their review criteria because they said the reviewers were focusing too much on minutiae of the scientific approach, what size test tube you used, which pipettes, what sort of gel you ran, etc., because people who are the reviewers do that on a day-to-day basis, and that's what's in their mind and what they confidently can review on a factual basis. And NIH said, no, if we're going to fund something for 5 years, we're not worried about that. That's what will get worked out in the lab. We want high-risk, high-reward science. We want things that are medically significant. And so they got together a group of people who were experts in testing and reviewing. And they put these people in a committee and had them come up with recommendations. And for example, one of their recommendations was that human beings are only able to grade things on a level 1 through 7. That's the most we can hold in our brain. You know, what's the pinkest pink, and what's the tastiest cookie, and which is the best coffee. You can get up to 7 gradations, and beyond that, you end up in no significance. So they said we should only have 7 gradations, so NIH made 9. And that's the story. And what they really did was they cut down from 49 grades, 1 through 5, you're allowed to grade in tenths, to 1 through 9, you're allowed to grade only in whole integers. Okay. Human nature being what it is, of course, there's grade inflation, and it ends up that many scorers grade only in the 1, 2, 3s, and 4s, and they don't give any 9s. It's very rare to see a 9. The second thing that turned it on its head with NIH in this was that even though they tried to push the reviewers away from minutiae of scientific approach, when they studied it subsequently, they found that's still what the reviewers are reviewing. So if you look at the top, that's the score, 1 through 9 on the ordinate of that graph, for the different subsets by which all NIH R01s are scored: approach, significance, innovation, investigator, and environment. And you see the far left one, approach, is the one that on average gets the worst score. Impact gets the second worst score. And then if you do multivariate analysis on the list on the right, you'll see the regression weight approach just swamps everything else in determining the final score given to that grant. So approach, significance are the two that drive the whole thing. And then environment, oh, I'm from UCSD, therefore this grant ought to do well, gets a regression weight of -0.1. You can be from Timbuktu, it doesn't matter with the reviewers.
So that means that if you're writing a grant and you're coming across the deadline, and somebody wants you to spend a lot of time on the environment section, and your chair or your division chief wants to flog all the capabilities and the successes and all that, if you have time for that, you can spend a little bit of time for that. Maybe if there's one crucial piece of equipment that you want to say is here, say it. But for heaven's sakes, don't waste any time and waste very little space on this. It doesn't feature.
And the second lowest, which is in your favor, is investigator. Because You're in class, you're starting out, you don't have a CV with 1,000 publications.
Is this
You don't
taking
have a
into
track
account-
record of 50 grants.
Is this accounting for that new investigator?
This was
Allowance?
a review summarized of 54,000 submitted applications with 32,000 of them discussed and the remainder nerfed. So it's all comers, and the new investigator ones would be swamped in that. So it's primarily driven by the majority of our ones that were submitted to NIH. So probably relatively little in the new investigator. And new investigators were suffering primarily because of approach. The established investigators would say, we've got a lab, we've got this machine, we reference our own paper that we can do the methods, and the new investigator has trouble with that. So the ranking the reviewers give to an individual as an investigator becomes not so important. The ranking they give to how you're going to carry out the research and do you have the capabilities to do it becomes quite important.
I think Abby's question is slightly different. These are the scores of the grant. So when you review a grant, you're allowed to say on a, as Mike was saying, on the 1 to 9 scale, you rate each one of these things. And then you ultimately see which things determine the total score. However, when it comes to funding, the new investigators get a small bit of extra credit. So that if you came in at the 14th percentile as an old investigator, you would receive, that's nice. We really like your work. Next, but no funding. Okay. If you came in at a 14th percentile as a new investigator, many institutes would give you the benefit of the doubt. So your question and Mike's data aren't exactly the same. Mike's saying what drives the review, and you're saying what drives the money.
So they don't actually say when they're reviewing it, this is a new investigator, and that influences the scores they get.
That doesn't influence the score. I mean, people do know if you're a new investigator. And maybe some reviewers will say, well, give the person a break. But not many.
Okay.
Yeah. There's bias both ways.
Okay.
Towards saying, oh, this is an established guy, we trust him, and saying, this is a new person, and we need to get some new blood in. But this data that's right here in the graphs is prior to the NIH giving bonus points to new investigators. Interesting question. And then the next graph down here, the little dots, and it pretty much says the obvious. When I was chair of a study section, that gave me access to everybody's scores. So I ranked the 19 reviewers and listed their scores, and if you look closely, you see that for the 2s and 3s, there's multiple overlapping dots on this. And so many of the scores were 2s and 3s. In fact, reviewer number 9 gave 3 3s, for example. So the scores tended to cluster around that of reviewed grants. But the other point is that if you get back a bad score, it may be you and it may be the reviewer. Because take a look at the bottom third, the left side third, the first 6 reviewers. They tended to give 2s and 3s, and there was, of those 6 reviewers, only 1 score worse than 5. Now look at the far right 6 reviewers. They tended to give very few 2s and 3s. There are no overlapping circles. And they gave 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 scores worse than 5. So this works in 2 ways. When I handed this data out to the 19 reviewers, they labeled themselves nice guys and curmudgeons. The curmudgeons, on one hand, are people who are willing just to score worse. But on the other hand, NIH is sort of schizophrenic about where your score should be, the reviewers are left not really knowing what a score means. And so NIH says your average score should be a 5. However, reviewers are reluctant to give 9s. There's grade inflation. And so if you get a reviewer who's subject to grade inflation, you get a better score. It's just so when you resubmit, then you have one of two options. You resubmit because you didn't get funded, and you can go to the original reviewer, which is probably good for reasons I'll get into. Or if you got a poor score and you resubmit, and the original reviewer is now off study section, and you therefore get a new major reviewer, chances are, statistically, that you're going to get a good guy instead of a curmudgeon if you got a curmudgeonly score on the very first one. So I think it's important to keep in mind when you decide, am I going to resubmit? Both to a journal and for your grant. And the hard data is on the next page if you flip this over at the bottom. And just look at the 2006 column, because the numbers are stunning for people who get their grant rejected. So back in 2006, which is the last year we have this kind of data that NIH allowed out, the A0 is the first submission. Okay. The actual A0 applications in 2006 was 14,000 applications. Of those, a little under 1,000 got an award for an award rate of 7%. Now, if you subtract the 1,000 from the 14,000, you say there's about 13,000 grants that didn't get funded. How many of them resubmitted? Well, 6,463 become A1s. So half of 13,000 resubmitted. What was the funding rate for them? 1,400 got funded for a funding rate of 22%, more than 3 times the funding rate of the A0. So you're holding the pink sheet in your hand and saying, oh my God, it's a lot of work to rewrite this, and they were really nasty. Should I go through the effort? Well, you go through the effort, you get 3 times the chance. Back then in 2006, you were allowed to have A2s. What happens with the A2s? Well, again, half of the A1s resubmitted as an A2. What was the funding rate? 45%. Now, what drives this?
I mean, people who get triaged don't tend to resubmit. I mean, the resubmissions would tend to be grants that didn't get triaged, right?
So
is that true, or is that not
I've
true?
resubmitted triage grants more than once
I
because of this data.
I think that you should, I would not focus on the fact that you got a triaged grant. I would read the reviews. When it comes to study section, we'll have 100 grants. We've got 2 days. There's no way you can do 100 grants, so we triage at some median number, and the median number might be 2.2, and the difference between a 2.2 and a 2.3, everyone knows is random. So you might have something that's triaged and that was actually really on the cusp, and the only way of knowing, there isn't, because it was never discussed. I've had grants that went from a triage to a first percentile. And yes, I did a good job of the revision, but there was just an enormous amount of variability in the system. Go ahead.
And I've had grants that went from unfunded at 7th percentile to triage on resubmission. So, indeed, it works both ways. But there's another way to look at it, which is you're better off with a crummy score than with a medium score. Medium scores are hard to fix. A 3 is hard to push to a 1. But a 5 is going to have very specific points that the reviewer hated and gives you something to rewrite. It's actually easier to rewrite a 5 than it is to rewrite a 3, to get the specific point. So you have to read and read between the lines and see, can I really answer this? But when you do answer it, you have to realize that there's about 2 chances out of 3 you're going to get your initial reviewer, and 1 chance out of 3 it's going to be somebody entirely new. So now you have to fashion your response. So initial reviewer makes 2 good comments and 1 completely inane comment. How do I approach this? Do I, you got to stroke the ego of the reviewer. He's not getting paid well. His only reward is ego support. And so if you don't support his ego, then you're hard up. But if you come to a new reviewer and you have altered your grant in response to an inane comment, the newer reviewer is not going to look favorably upon you. So you've got to, at that point, make your decision comment by comment. I'm going to accept and modify. I'm going to refute and support my refutation. But you can't just drop the comment. Just because it's inane, you can't ignore it. You got to deal with the whole thing.
But refuting with all the diplomatic skills that you can muster. There's the old expression, you can't win a pissing contest with a skunk. Remember the power disparities. Even if the reviewer said the world is flat, you've got to find a very tactful way of appreciating this reviewer's quest for understanding cosmogony. So
you do a praise sandwich.
Yeah.
So I've made a little list on the top of this page of what you do when you get the nasty pink sheet, or what you do when you send in your journal article and you get back the review. Number 1 is get over it, and number 2 is get over it. One of my tricks is to take it and put it in a drawer, close the drawer, not deal with it until I internally have gotten over it. This was great. This was the idea that's going to save the world. They just don't see it. To a different context. They didn't see it. How did I phrase it improperly so that they did not see it? He didn't get it. How do I make sure that he did get it? How do I restructure, draw a diagram, make it clearer, learn from the reviewer just how to write? The science is great. I'm fully behind my idea, but I need then to win the reviewer over. So, use facts, logic, additional explanation, references. So all of this has been very similar between journal articles and grants. I think it applied to both. The one difference at the bottom is that for grant resubmissions, you must show progress. If you don't upgrade your submission to say, this is what's happened in the last 3 months in the lab, that is the next step, and we're marching on and we have progress, then the reviewer looks at it as, well, we're not that interested, or the lab isn't that active, or it's just not very convincing. So, whereas a paper, you've got to stick to exactly what you submitted before and then revise appropriately. With a grant, you need to continue to make progress and show that you're marching on.
I think one of the, your point about get over it, that's such helpful advice. You're going to get maddening reviews for the rest of your life. And this is sometimes people think university life is ivory towers, secluded, quiet, peaceful, green campuses, collegial discussions, a community of scholars. I think that's wonderful aspirational view. but you're going to get a lot of very tough reviews, and you've got to learn to deal with them. I think one of the things is just remembering you got to get beyond it and do put it aside for a couple days. I know a guy here, very senior, who threw his telephone across the room and stormed out, but eventually he got through it. I think the tricks of getting through it, though, there are some things that do help people. I've found that, you can triage easy things versus hard things, and just beginning working and leave the hard things for later. But the easy things, you'll build up a sense of confidence, and in the meantime, you really truly are marinating in your brain the tough comments, and you'll have a chance to work on it. But do the easy things, the low-hanging fruit things. It makes it easier to get beyond the review to the next step. What other things do you find helpful when you try to revise something?
The other thing I've constantly got to keep in my head is he didn't get it, why? I used to write that in response to reviews. Well, obviously on page 3, line 7, already addressed this point. No. After you go the other side of the table and you get on a review committee, you realize that is not the right answer. The right answer is, I've clarified what I wrote on page 3, line 7, and here it is. And you just say it in a way that comes across. I mean, really, the half of the trick is getting your point across. It's the art of writing, and half of it is actually doing the research. And so that's been one of the things I constantly have to hold in front of myself.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit at the last session. There was a kind of back and forth about who are we writing for, what grade level, what degree of sophistication can we expect. We're writing for each other. We're writing for young mothers and young fathers who are sleep deprived with a young kid, and they're trying to review something, and they've got baby burp all over them while they're trying to review, and it's got to glide. And yes, you're writing for people who've got tremendous education, but most people are doing this in the nighttime when they're exhausted already, and they don't read with the care that they are capable of. And we have to find a way of making things absolutely clear. Mike's a genius at this. I mean, graphics and schematic cartoons, diagrams that summarize all the complexity that each one of us is studying.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So regarding the last point where you must show progress in your submission, most of us junior investigators don't have our own lab really, and we don't have X number of postdocs working on the same project. So there's a limit on how much progress we can actually produce within the 1 year or 2 time frame of we realistically produce a resubmission. In that case, how do we package this limitation without showing us a clear weakness?
The best way I can think of, if you don't really have new data, is to take a look at the review and find the scientific points that you need to address, and then go to the literature. You can address things in intellectual progress. You brought up this point, and so I looked it up, and this author says that this methodology worked. The other is to refer to other people in their labs and they may have preliminary data, and there's a big enough place around here that investigators in your area really get their ego stroked by you asking them and are willing to share what advances they have made. And then you can reference, regarding this point, unpublished observation from so-and-so and show that you've given some new information there. Now that doesn't convey that I have an active lab that's running, but it does convey emotionally to the reviewer, oh, there's ferment, the ideas are progressing. And they don't really think, oh, did this come out of the investigator's lab? Did this come out of another investigator's lab? Did this come out of a reference? No, it's progress, and in that regard, it's a narrative that continues on. And so it's, like the next version of House and the next disease, and we progress, and the reviewers like a story. So if you can take those points and get some new information and make it into a continuation of the story, and the story to be continued if you just give me the money, and we'll continue some more. It makes a much more compelling point that way.
So perhaps invite some of them as your co-investigator in resubmission.
That
help collaborate.
That certainly is a good point if, number one, you read the investigator paragraph in the pink sheet and it's not glowing, okay? Or number two, if they add real substance. Okay? But you don't necessarily have to invite a new person. You can say, serves as a consultant, but you don't have to put them on as a salaried person. But if they have questions about technical things, and you can provide the lab that has the technical answer and reference it, then that's very helpful.
Mike, I wonder if we can return to one of these plots, the one that had the regression weight, because I'm absolutely certain that, as you point out, that the approach is still getting the major emphasis. But I have a feeling over time the impact of the innovation is acquiring a much more prominent weighting than is revealed in these scores, which were from a couple years ago. The last time I was back on a study section, the innovation is starting to get weighted a lot more heavily. I mean, the approach still drives everything. And at least the ones that I've sat on, the significance, it's like everybody knows breast cancer is important. I mean, the significance is, not a big deal to make to put a lot in, unless you're studying something really obscure. If you're studying something obscure, you really have to make that point. But increasingly, people are after this innovation, and what I've seen in my pink sheets and other pink sheets are these veiled references to innovation. And this is one of the things where, using all the techniques we can muster in font design, bold print, all that, leading the reviewer along to the innovation section and making sure that he or she has seen what you wrote. Because if he didn't see it, he's not going to remember it. Now, by the way, I use the word pink sheet. Do you know why they're called pink sheets? Have you ever heard the expression pink sheets? You've heard them? See, those of us, this will be, in 50 years, I think it'll probably we'll all be dead and gone by then. But the reviews used to come in the mail. There was a time before the internet. The reviews came in the mail on pink paper. Ergo, the pink sheet. So.
And talk about getting over it and putting it away. Some of us would get the letter, not open it.
Yeah, it took took enormous courage to open this thing and see what your score was. And the other problem with the pink sheet was that if you got really annoyed and you're starting to write swine on the pink sheet, that's the only copy, you know, so that now, at least with the electronic thing, you know, it's there, and it's a durable comment. It's kind of hard to write back to NIH and say, I got so upset with your comments that I tore them up. Can you please send me another batch?
You had a question?
Do you have any advice on walking on the right side of innovation versus feasibility?
I think innovation is easier for you folks than for us. Okay, for example, I do catecholamine research, and it went to fluorometric, and then it went to radioenzymatic, and then it went to ELISAs, and then it went to high-pressure liquid chromatography, electrochemical detection, and then it went to liquid chromatography with mass spectroscopy, each of those steps. And, you know, I got to make the next jump and constantly keep up with it. Well, fortunately, you folks came in and say, how am I going to do it? Well, sure, liquid chromatography with mass spectroscopy, how else would I do it? You're already there. So you have the innovation, and so it hits Joel and I much harder, but it's like the internet and lack of pink sheets. It's your way of life, so take advantage of it. And UCSD is up to date, and much of the technology that you put forward in your grants will resonate with the people. But your reviewer is going to be a guy in the field, or 50% because of NIH requirements, a gal in the field, who is up to date, who's doing the research now, and it is going to be there. So yeah, you've got to be innovative, but it will come much more naturally to you.
The innovative refers to the idea of the question you're asking, not the technology that you apply to your question.
That's where I like you to look at the graph approach and say approach is twice as powerful as the next best. Technological innovation becomes part of the approach, and it's what the reviewer has easily to hold in his mind because he was just doing it yesterday. If you're lucky and you get a reviewer in your own area. Innovation, insofar as it is a new idea, is where you really want to be going. It doesn't mean you're going to be scored well for it. When radioimmunoassay was discovered and the application came into the NIH saying, I'm going to measure hormones with a radioimmunoassay, the NIH turned it down and said, oh, that approach will never work. Obviously, it took over the world. So true innovation is a tough sell. And if you're truly innovative, you have to realize it's a tough sell. I've got to get my point across very clearly and say why this is good and back it up with literature. Technological innovation is easy, and you can use it.
But that's why it's so trendy in research. Everybody's doing the same kind of study because it's the newest.
That's right.
It gets a little bit of self-defeating, I think, as a field.
I fully agree. I fully agree. Genomics is the prime example. We've been saying, oh, this is innovative. We're really going to go and we figured out how to genotype. And then if you look at what's come out of the millions and millions or billions and billions of dollars in genomics, it's not been a lot. But it's the innovation, and it's the world you're going to live in. And it's clearly the future, maybe 20 years from now.
Oh, no, I just, like, if you could do one experiment to show that it worked, I mean, would something like that just add, or is that not even worth it to try to get done before you submit a grant?
Well, actually, this is interesting, because in the old days, the preliminary data section
was big,
could
right?
be substantial. Yeah. And that's where people like Mike and me had some advantages, because running a lab, you of course have lots of preliminary data. I think you have to be a little bit more discriminating today. Instead of summarizing 8 of your various studies that back up what you're proposing to do, you may maybe only have space to do 1 or 2 studies, but it does help to show that you can do something like this. If you're just kind of all over the place, people fault you and say, well, she doesn't know where she's going.
And if the very practical question comes up, do I delay responding to this review because I'm going to do more work in the lab? I'd say in general, no. Just get on with it. But sometimes the answer is yes. The critical experiment that's really going to sell it is in the incubator, but generally no.
Before we go on to looking at some of the reviews that we've received, are there some other comments or questions that you might have? People who haven't had a chance to ask a question? Or?
Yeah. This side of the table's been dominated. Give me a question.
Which reviews have been hardest to respond in your lives? Which types of reviews pose the greatest challenges?
Dina, I know you've got some.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm actually thinking about my my husband's first RO1 that came back with, 1s and 2s from 2 reviewers and 7 and 8s from the 3rd reviewer. And the first and second reviewer had, and of course there's 1 page to respond. And the first and second reviewer had some very good and important points to respond to. And the next reviewer essentially, and this is where when you talk about kind of coming down off of the I hate all these people, I'm going to tear up the sheets thing. When you came down off of that, he had a real problem with the whole kind of field of inquiry. And so it was very hard to kind of diffuse that. So, I was helping him write this, and we kept moving you've got 1 page, so do you spend this much on the good reviewers and this much on the 1 reviewer? Where do you draw the line, and where do you, I think the point that you made at the start, you can't really say back to the reviewers, no, actually the Earth is round and you're a nut. You have to say, I appreciate the comments of the reviewer, but. And I think that was the real dilemma, where do you, when you guys see this stuff coming back to study section, and there's discrepancy or there's stuff like that, how do you deal with drawing those lines?
It's really been helpful for me in those cases to have been on the other side of the table and to be a reviewer, and in some cases to be the reviewer who shoots down a proposal because I think I see a critical flaw in someone else doesn't. And so when I get those kind of reviews, the first thing I do is try to go to the other side of the mirror and put myself in that person's frame of mind and say, what did he really see that killed this? And then the response comes depending on that viewpoint. If you can just get into his head and read between the lines and realize what's going on, then you can say, oh, it's technical and he thinks I can't do it, I need to back that up, or it's conceptual and he thinks that it's trivial, I need to document that this is an important question, or you go on down the line like that. Your job is made somewhat easier by, you always start out, we thank reviewer number 1 who praised this, and reviewer number 2 who praised this, and reviewer number 3 raised some questions which we now address. And then reviewer number 3 is reading that and says, well, other people thought it was worthwhile. At least I have to open my mind up to read this response.
But the space is really hard.
The space is actually very important. Unlike a journal article, where you can
go on and on, and your response letter to the editor could be longer than the manuscript.
I mean, we just had one that was like 18 pages back to the, it just went, because, once you include the comments, I brought those comments, I mean, the comments themselves were 2.5 pages. So it just went on and on. I
did a report for the National Academy of Sciences, and we got 150 pages of comments. Our report was 75. because it was government policy but I think one of the things you have to do, sometimes when you do the craft a journal response, some people verbatim list the entire reviewer's comment and then the response. You can't do that. You don't have space for that. So, as Mike said, we thank the reviewers for their attention to our proposal. In this page, we'll discuss the major criticisms were raised, and other areas will be dealt with, interwoven in the text, and are marked in bold print, however you want to do that. That's one way. You've got it. So you're selecting, and you do try to honestly distill, as Mike said, get in their head what the reviewer's concern was, and then you've got a little bit of response room. I think one page. I prefer 2 pages, but I think you can do it at one. It takes a lot of discipline to get into that 1-page framework, but you can again address some of the minor issues in the text.
Another way I've seen which merges what Joel was talking about, it was what I've seen Gary Firestein do on responses, which is to go through the text and change the text first, and then write the response letter at the beginning. And that makes it easier mentally to make a very short statement referring to the change in the text on a given page, because you're not going to have sufficient space in the response letter.
And make no mistake about it, that 1 page determines everything. That 1 page determines everything. So if you're saying, well, what's that 1 page worth? That 1 page is worth your entire total direct cost and indirect cost. So you have to make that page absolutely clear, and you need, if your colleagues have time to read just 1 page, give them that page to read. That's the most important page for revision. Let's look at some of the comments we've received. Who wants to go first? Okay. Mike?
Okay.
Reviewers read this page first, even though they didn't review the first submission.
That's right. If you get a new reviewer, if I'm the new reviewer, I will read the response first.
My understanding now is that they don't necessarily
when you get a revised application, you only see what the study, what the previous Gestalt ranking was.
So I've seen some people put the scores in their page if they want to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they'll actually say, we really appreciated the ones in, this total score, the average score of 1.8 on our first grant or whatever.
Yeah.
Why not?
And again, one of the really troubling things is that you will most assuredly have at least 1 new reviewer.
Right.
You are not going to get just the same 3 reviewers. You won't. And that can be very disheartening. And it's tough for the new reviewer if he or she sees something that the others missed. But they have to call it the way they found it. Okay, Mike, do you want to tell us?
Yeah, I was trying to get a copy for myself up here.
Here.
So the idea of this paper was to compare Cox proportional hazards model of time to progression, particularly progression from MCI to Alzheimer's disease, to a linear mixed effects model of a continuous outcome over time. And the sort of mathematical crux of the paper was relating a treatment effect size in terms of proportional hazards model to a difference in slopes over time of in a continuous outcome linear mixed effects model. And I apologize, just on the way over I realized that Reviewer 1 comments are not explicit in here, but I could reconstruct them from the response.
So that's the first thing that you would change about this?
Include the comments?
I would recap Reviewer number 1 question.
So I did that for the second reviewer. I don't know if there was an issue with transcribing the text or something. I don't know why I didn't do it for the first reviewer. Yeah. So should we just go through the?
Keep in mind that the editor, what you really want to do with a revision for a journal article, if you sense the editor is asking for a minor revision, you want to assure the editor that he's got enough data so he doesn't have to send this out for review again. Most editors are conscientious. They know people need quick responses. And if I don't have to go rifling through the file and bookmark here and there, and if I get the sense that, this is what the reviewer was concerned about, and this is what I did, then I can say, fine, I follow that, that sounds good, now I'll read it, good. For major revision, it's going to go back to the reviewers, but the reviewers are just the same. They're busy. They don't necessarily want to go back and refer back to what they said, but they want to make sure that you caught their drift, that you didn't try to pull a fast one and skip an important point. Anyway, go ahead.
So should we just go point by point through the?
Why don't you do reviewer number 2?
Okay.
Yeah.
Since you've got.
You have it actually.
Yeah, you have the
Later.
transcript.
Oh, it is later?
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah,
Go
and
2 pages in the other next font.
In the bigger font, you would put what
You have it
Reviewer
all.
1 said, and then how you responded. Looks like you changed it.
Oh, okay. What is? Oh, it's the same stuff too.
Yeah,
Okay,
yes.
that's all that.
That's how you
Okay.
started, right?
Thank you. So the first question was about relating effect sizes being compared. In particular, the critique that little effort was made to relate the effect sizes. And they also suggested trying a different survival model than Cox. So we thanked them for the insightful suggestion. And pointed out that we actually did explicitly do what they were asking for. And we had a series of lines of formulas, and the first one was a Cox proportional hazards hazard ratio and some math, and on the other side was a difference in slopes. So so it did exactly what, to my mind, it was exactly what they were asking for. So yeah, I think this was.
So in that, you started out, the first sentence was your top layer of the praise sandwich.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And your last line is beyond the scope of this paper. Could instead be, we have analyzed it and both methods gave essentially the same results, and so we think. So you say the same thing.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do the different method than you did, but instead you put it in the terms, oh, you had a good idea and it worked out both ways.
Right. the underlying issue was that the math is a lot easier with the Cox proportional hazards model. Things don't work out as cleanly if we had switched to the Weibull distribution.
Yeah. So you could say, the Cox method with simpler technology gave essentially the same results as the Weibull, and that's why we stuck with the Cox. But it begins and ends on a positive note.
Sometimes what people do here is to say, we appreciate the reviewer's suggestion, and because of the page limitations of the manuscript and the editor's suggestion, we feel that it would be difficult to do this justice in this one manuscript. But for your interest, here's what it is. Here's what we found, and you kind of give them a page and that, so that the reviewer sees that you are carefully taking into consideration. It's another way of spinning it, so to speak.
Yeah. So what do you do if your PI just doesn't want to do any more experiments and is like, I just don't want to do that anymore, I just want to get the paper published? You just send it to another journal?
So what do you do if you get a revision that and the PI says, we got to get this out, we can't mess around with these people anymore?
I'm just tired of, I just don't want to do any more experiments on this and get this out.
I think you maximize your odds if you do respond, even if you don't know the new experiment, because the acceptance rate for revisions is so much higher than the acceptance rate for initial application, and you haven't lost a whole ton of time by doing that.
Remember one of the first sessions we had together with editors, and we were discussing that good editors try to kill manuscripts quickly, because the last thing they want to do to authors is to make them go back and forth, and they have a dickens of a time getting reviewers.
And to give an example of one paper we were writing that we really wanted to get into hypertension, an American Heart Journal was the best in the blood pressure range, and it came back and said rejected, but came with all the comments. And so the junior investigator was ready to say, okay, on to the next one, and everybody senior on it who'd been around and seen this says, no, that doesn't mean they rejected it at all. It means that as they said, if you send it back in, it will be reviewed as a de novo submission, the famous editor words. And it went back to the same reviewers, and it's accepted for not a tremendous amount of extra work. So again, you got to read through the lines. And if you get one of those comments back from a journal, if you can take that to someone else who has submitted to that same journal and say, what does editor speak for this journal? Particularly for the ones with a high rejection rate, like hypertension that rejects, I think, 88% of the papers that are submitted to it, then you have a leg up on knowing how to respond.
So there's a difference between the letter that says, we're rejecting it, but if you want to come back, we'll consider it de novo, and then coming back with that. There's a difference between that and this is rejected. And with nicety, due to space, priorities, blah, blah, blah. We're sure you're a fine person.
So why do they do that?
Some people will appeal those rejections, and you can appeal a rejection. You don't want to do that very often. Don't want to do that very often at all. But the de novo consider, that's an invitation to come back.
So the de novo means you send it in, I'm going to send it back out to reviewers. And the waffling may be accepted means it's possible that the editor is going to accept it without sending it back out to the reviewers. And in that case, it's important to do what Joel said, the structure here. lay out, this was the question, this is my answer, this is a question, this is my answer. Because the editor is not going to be as expert in the area as the reviewer he sent it out to, and so you spell it out, and you can look at it and say, oh yeah.
I want to make sure, who else brought comments? Bailey, did you bring?
Yeah, but I skipped over the part where you wanted major revisions. I missed that part.
So what did you bring?
One that was just minor revisions, not a major revision. So.
This wasn't really major either.
Well, send it around. Let's for everybody who brought something in, we'll just pick one or two paragraphs, so we have a chance to get a sense for it.
So I think this was accepted as I learned back out.
Yeah. So this article or this paper was basically looking at glycopeptide Siglix and CD4 T cell survival in humans. It's been something that's been documented more commonly in monkeys, but it's unknown whether or not it has much significance in humans. So we did some ex vivo experiments to show that it might. And that's kind of what this was about.
We're looking at the one that's
Dr. Ganton.
addressed to Dr. Ganton.
Yeah. So, and this is the PI that said, I will not do any more experiments. Let's just try to get this published. So this, I think, was after, this is a third journal, because the other journals that this was submitted to really wanted more experiments, and this one was not quite as rigorous. Let's see. Should I just, I'm not sure which one to pick. Just the first one, maybe?
Pick whichever.
Let's see if I can find one. Oh, I guess comment number 7 on the third page might be one that would be helpful. So basically they were questioning whether or not the negative controls were treated exactly like the experiments, and they asked if they were mock infected to rule out whether or not it was the infection, the process of the infection, or the actual virus itself that was changing the Siglix. In our response, I mean, because we were like, I don't know if maybe there wasn't more nicer or
probably.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, like that was one that we were kind of struggling with. How do we word? This is not the one that I think that ultimately went out, but we didn't really know how to word that in a better.
So let me ask you, what was your control for that? You had some cells that were infected, and you compared them to what?
To the cells that went through the exact same process that didn't have virus in it.
Okay, so you could just as easily have said, yes,
it had
we mock infected with a placebo solution that had no virus in it, and we compared the two, and that's the result in figure number whatever. And that's a positive spin to this, instead of saying, I don't understand what you give the presidential answer, and the presidential answer is you answer the question you wish they had asked. Okay. So I interpret their question as the mock control is the saline. Okay. And they're there. And if they don't like it, then they can come back, but they're much less likely to come back to one when you say, oh yeah, we did that. Than they are to say, we don't understand.
Lots of ways of doing the same thing. We share the reviewer's concerns about adequate, I'm sorry, I do this for a living. We share the reviewer's concerns about adequate controls, and for this reason we've done this ABC. Other thoughts about how you might respond to something like this? If you got it?
I'm just thinking, you can only take it so far. I've done a bunch of reviews lately, and I got one back where every paragraph, thanked me for my insightful. It's like, thank you for your insightful thoughts. We elected not to answer your question. We very much appreciate the reviewer's comment. We have not answered this question in the paper either. And by the time I got to the third of these, I was ticked off, because it got sent back to me for second review. I'm like, well, you just have to do around 50% of what I asked. I asked for 6 things. So there has to be some, you have to decide which of the things you're going to do, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're going to do something of what they ask.
Well, and give some justification for not doing it.
Or give some justification.
I'll admit to having the same feelings with papers. They're trying overly hard to be nice without offering substance in return.
Some substance, right.
And when you get to substance, you say, well, they didn't agree with me, but at least they really thought it through. So you do have to be polite, and you do have to stroke the reviewer's ego, but you also have to not sound like you're doing just exactly that.
But in some way, that's why addressing grants is so much easier, because you can promise something without having to do it in the revision, whereas this you sort of...
That was a good idea, I'll definitely do it. Give me the money and I'll do it.
That's funny.
We've never done that, have we? In fact, that has driven the NIH to modify the reviewer instructions. The previous reviewer instructions were pretty free form and allowed the reviewer to sort of rewrite part of the grants. Say, I thought it would have been better if you had done this and this and this in your approach to your research. And of course, the grant comes back and say, we're going to do this and this and this in the approach to the research. And then how's the reviewer going to turn it down? It's suddenly his grant. Okay. In response to that, NIH has said, you've got a heading significance. We have pre-formatted bullet points. You fill in the bullets with your good points and criticisms. And we only want short sentences or maybe even phrases. Is the instructions you now get from the NIH, because NIH saw that the reviewers were rewriting the grants.
So there's much more in between the lines that we have to try to interpret.
So the reviewer still wants to rewrite the grant. and so if you can just figure out how he wanted to rewrite it, that's the point. Now, for papers, the reviewer can make positive, supportive points and give you a reference that you should consider this point. You can incorporate it or not. And that's good, unlike the NIH. For papers, that's considered okay.
Let's turn and pick on one of the issues in a letter to Dr. Gaines.
Oh, I didn't circulate it all the way. I got confused with the whole what's going on here.
Send it out.
And I apologize, I misread the instructions. It doesn't have my comments. But this was a paper, actually. This was a second review. So they weren't satisfied with the first review, but they still invited me to resubmit. So this was the second round of revisions on that one.
Well, that's okay.
So the major critique, so let me just give you a little bit of background here. This was a paper that was looking at a population of sex workers in Tijuana, Mexico. And the paper was focusing on policy that regulates sex work. And what I was interested in was whether the venue where these women solicited from had an effect on whether or not they engaged in this policy framework. So with the first draft and then the second revision, my take on it was, well, let me just go with the second revision. The first concern was that the reviewers didn't really know what the public health benefit was to engaging in this policy to regulate sex work. So I made that clear in the first revision, and the other critique was my conclusion. It just went on and on and on, so they wanted me to make it more succinct. So I took care of those, and then it came back the second time saying, well, great, you've clarified your objective, you've clarified why this is an important question to look at, but there's two things that you missed. One is the human rights literature around regulating, or this policy that regulates sex work that needs to be incorporated into your manuscript. And the other concern was the policy. There wasn't enough policy discussion in there. And so this is a major revision paper because I had to go back through the literature to include this human rights angle and weave it in both the introduction and the discussion. I had to shift my objective. So I didn't revise my hypothesis, but I had to cleverly shift the objective so that I could explain why it was still important to look at this policy around regulating sex work. And then the other big issue was the policy itself. In Mexico, sex work is quasi-legal, so there's not really a policy around this. So the critique from the reviewer of, well, incorporate some more policy discussion into your paper wasn't possible. So it took some handling there of bringing in some discussion, but not making the paper about that because it's lacking in the first place.
In your first response, did you list the reviewer's comments and then your response?
Yes.
Okay. So.
But they didn't touch upon this until the second review.
Okay.
They didn't bring in
some
this.
new ideas, basically.
Yeah.
Same reviewers.
Yeah. Exactly, new ideas. So the new ideas meaning I need to bring in more of the human rights literature and the policy discussion, which wasn't at all addressed in the first. So it took actually 2 months for me to get this finally off my desk. It was one where I had to ask for additional time.
So, and you know, actually that's a good comment. Some journals give you a time clock on revisions, and they will all extend the clock if you ask them. I've never encountered a journal that won't extend the time clock if you ask them.
I've never asked.
You know, not that I had a good summer, and I'll get to this in spring. But I mean, you know, some reason for it. They'll do that. They might not want to do it twice. So if you're going to ask them to extend the clock, ask for enough time. You know, if they normally ask for 6 weeks, you might be able to ask for a total of 12, but don't ask for 18. They're not going to go for that. So how much more text did you have to add to the introduction?
Introduction, there were 3 paragraphs where I took out and added to. So the introduction initially was, I think 6 paragraphs. I didn't change that. But for the last 3 paragraphs, I heavily modified those.
Okay.
And in the discussion, I would say about half of that completely changed from what I had in. Yeah, it was major revisions. And that was because of this human rights literature that reviewer 1 wanted me to incorporate, and the editor also had said, these are the 2 points you need to address in your manuscript. So that required me to change about half of the discussion.
And that's pretty common to have to totally rewrite your discussion section. Joel has more experience with this than me, but you know, my experience is that, and as a reviewer, is that the discussion section tends to be a little free-form and overly enthusiastic, and the reviewers generally tamp that down and say, no, only what the data supports, and don't even discuss this paragraph because it has nothing to do with the data you originally had. And then yours went a monstrous step farther than that. Yeah. Review this whole new literature and put it in. But again, if you try to flip tables and look at it from the reviewer's side, obviously you had a reviewer who was very into human rights and thought that should be brought up over and over again. Some people are of such a mind, and other people say, no, I'm more interested in the transmission of a particular virus by a particular route, and the science rather than the human rights. And you obviously had to cope with the desires of that reviewer.
Yeah. No, obviously that reviewer liked your paper, or the editor liked the paper enough to say, you know, we want this back, but this has to be given more emphasis. It's hard for me to know in terms of the journal, the length of the paper. You maybe did more of a radical revision than was necessary. usually when I see something like this, they're asking for one thoughtful paragraph in the introduction, or maybe two, and one or two paragraphs in the discussion that address this. Your way is probably better.
So it may get accepted finally.
Well, good. So the proof is in the pudding. So,
No, I don't know yet, but I'm just saying if I went overboard.
But I guess some of the problems are our own time clocks. We all are under pressure. We need to publish so much by the time of our next review, academic review. We need to publish so much in order to generate a track record for our next grant application, all these sorts of things, so that sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. So we sometimes don't do ourselves a service by doing the radical 4-month revision as opposed to the 2-month revision. It can take, a big revision can take 2 months, but if it's taking 4 months, maybe find a mentor who gives you the encouragement to kind of get going. I mean, I read that review as, hey, we really like this, but these are 2 themes that are really important to add. And the answer is, you're right. Thank you for the encouragement and allowing us to develop these themes. Page 1, paragraph 3 is new. Page 18, I mean, you know, that's what I would do.
I read through comment number 1 that you were addressing, and I would have the same dilemma as you. Do I really go through this and give everything he's asking for, or do I give more lip service?
Yeah.
And you have both of those. I think you could have been more concise, but on the other hand, clearly it was the reviewer's dream to have you turn this into a human rights discussion. You can't always say no. Or you can give it more of a short shrift.
And my take was to appease reviewer 1 by incorporating that in the discussion and the intro, which was part of the reason why it took so long, was that I need to do additional reviews, literature review.
And you have to decide up front, you know, how much am I going to bow down to what they want and how much am I going to stand up and say that's not really the direction of the paper. Mike Donahue said, well, thank you for your comment on this more difficult mathematical procedure, but I'm going to stick with the Cox. And you said, oh, I'm going to spend 2 months reviewing the literature. I think they're both going to get accepted.
I want to make, in the final couple minutes that we have this evening, did anyone else bring comments in? Anyone else bring? Do you want to just?
I did. No, I'm good. Mine was accepted, so I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said mine was accepted, so I'm good. I just found out this morning, so I'm good. But
mine is already accepted also, but it was one of those, you know, this paper, we are rejecting this paper. It is not publishable in its current form, but we're sending you, you know, 2 months worth of work. And it was kind of interesting to try to decide whether to do it or not. We did it and it got published, so you don't need to see it. But it was definitely one of those things where you're like, well, they want a completely different paper from the paper we've submitted the first round.
So that was Mike's point earlier. There's no reason that you should be able to understand the editor's terms of art the first time around, particularly when you're young and just starting out. This is where you need to talk with your mentor. What is this person really saying to me with this letter? You get better with it after you've seen a bunch of these. But sometimes you get the darndest letters that actually reflect the editor's ambivalence.
Yeah.
So you're respectfully listening to that ambivalence and responding to it. Okay, I think we'll stop for this evening.